All right, so today we're going to dive deeper into photosynthesis. So remember, photosynthesis is the process that takes energy from light and converts it into chemical energy. Our overall equation for photosynthesis is 6 CO2, which is carbon dioxide, plus 6 H2O, which is water, and we know we need light. Okay, so I'm going to write light above the arrow because it's not really a reactant or a product. We just need it for the reaction to happen. Then we are going to produce glucose, which is C6H12O6, and 6O2, which is oxygen molecules. Now, photosynthesis doesn't just take carbon dioxide and water and easily turn it into glucose and oxygen. So instead, photosynthesis happens in two separate phases. So our two separate phases are called the light reactions and the dark reactions. So today, we're going to look at each of those phases to help us understand photosynthesis a little bit better. So the first phase is the light reactions. So these ones require light, and they happen in this structure right here called the thylakoid membrane. So here, this entire structure is the chloroplast, and inside the chloroplast, we have little stacks of thylakoids. Okay, so inside the thylakoid, we have the light-absorbing pigments, which is what's going to allow this first phase to happen. The second phase is called the dark reactions, or the light-independent reactions. So this one doesn't need light to occur. And these ones take place in the stroma of the chloroplast. So this here, this gray space is all the stroma. This is just like a fluid-filled space surrounding the thylakoids. So in your notes, you should write both phases of photosynthesis, and you should pause this video and go ahead and copy this diagram of the chloroplast in your notes. Make sure you label the thylakoids. Okay, so make sure you label the thylakoids and make sure you label the stroma. All right, so we're going to focus on phase 1 first. So phase 1 is called the light-dependent reactions, or just the light reactions. So in this phase, light energy is absorbed, and light energy is absorbed by the pigments that are found in the thylakoids. So in this picture, here's thylakoids. This is a thylakoid also. And remember, last week we talked about different types of pigments, but the most popular one and the one that we are going to focus on is chlorophyll. So that's the actual structure that absorbs the light energy. And this energy, it's going to be used to move electrons through an electron transport system. So when the light energy, when it comes into the chloroplast, okay, it becomes absorbed in the thylakoid because of the pigment or because of chlorophyll. That light energy, it's going to excite electrons in those molecules, and it's going to cause water to split. And so when this happens, water gets broken up into basically a proton. So hydrogen with a positive charge is just a proton. We have electrons and then also oxygen. So right now we're only going to focus on the electron. So this excited electron, it's going to move through the thylakoid, and this electron is going to eventually help form this molecule called NADPH. Okay. Now there are some intermediate steps in between, but we don't really need to know the nitty-gritty. So we just need to know that when light energy enters the thylakoid, it's going to split water, okay, and we now have free electrons, and that electron is going to eventually form NADPH. Now, also during this process, our other molecule that holds energy, ATP, is also going to be formed. So, the big ideas that you need to know for this step is that water molecules are going to split and they're going to provide electrons. And then these electrons are going to essentially convert all that chemical energy into ATP and NADPH. All right, so on this slide, I have a couple links to some extra videos that help explain this process. I unfortunately can't play you these videos because I'm on my recording software, but I will post these on our Power School Learning page. This first one goes to the Amoeba Sisters, and they will explain photosynthesis. And then the second one, it is from the McGraw-Hill app, and it's just like a really nice simulation that explains like more of the electron transport process of how ATP and NADPH are actually produced in these light reactions. So feel free to go ahead and pause this video and check out both of these videos to help you understand phase 1 of photosynthesis. All right, so now I want to take a closer look at the electron transport chain. So we're going to see where the electrons go inside the thylakoid to figure out how NADPH is produced, and then we'll also look at how ATP is made. So this diagram is like a blown up figure of the thylakoid, and light travels as little packets called photons. So when the photon hits this reaction center, it's in this thing called photosystem 2. You don't have to know that much detail though. Okay. It's going to excite the electron, or it's going to have extra energy. Then 2 water molecules are going to bind to this water splitting enzyme right here, still at the reaction center. So then this enzyme is going to be what actually splits the water molecules up. And so when this happens, an electron is going to replace the original electron that gets excited from that photon of light. We're also going to get 4 protons, so just hydrogen with a plus charge is called a proton. And oxygen is also going to be produced. All right, then our originally excited electron is going to travel through the thylakoid membrane, and it's going to get to this structure called a proton pump. So once this extra energized electron makes it to the pump, it's going to allow protons to be passed through this channel. Okay, so now we're going to get extra protons pumped into the inside of the thylakoid. So now we have a bunch of protons on the inside of the thylakoid, and this membrane, it is impermeable to protons, which means that they can't just move through the membrane on their own. So in order to get out into the stroma, or the surrounding area, the protons have to move through a channel. And in this process, they move through this very specific channel called ATP synthase. Okay, ATP is our energy carrying molecule, and then synthase comes from the word like synthesize, and ACE is going to mean it's like an enzyme. So this is going to allow ATP to be created. So as the protons pass through the ATP synthase, it is going to phosphorylate the ADP and allow that third phosphate to be bonded back on, and it's going to allow ATP to be created. Okay, so this is how ATP is made during this process. All right, so now that we know how the ATP is created, let's go back to how NADPH is created. So now we're going to look at this area called photosystem 1. So when photons of light hit this reaction center, it's going to cause these high energy electrons to continue moving. We get to a protein called ferredoxin, and that is going to transfer the electron to an electron carrier called NADP+. And from there, that electron is going to allow the NADP+ to change to NADPH. All right, so now this electron transport chain, it is extremely complicated. You do not have to memorize this. However, it is good to see where the electrons are moving and how the ATP is created and the NADPH is created. So we are going to copy this diagram. It's good to have this diagram and to be able to follow it a little bit, but the only thing that you have to memorize is in this process, ATP is created and NADPH. Okay, so you absolutely have to memorize that those two molecules are created, but I do want you to pause the video and go ahead and record this diagram in your notes. Okay, so to sum up, phase one, or the light-dependent reactions, our big idea is water, or H2O, it's used to make NADPH, and oxygen is released. And then in addition to the NADPH, remember, ATP is also produced. Okay, so now let's go back and relate phase one to the overall equation of photosynthesis. So remember, our equation for photosynthesis is 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 H2O, and light energy is going to produce glucose and oxygen. Okay. So I'm just going to rewrite that to put it all on one line. Okay, so we have 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O. And then I like to put light above the arrow, so I'm just going to put light there rather than saying plus light on the reactant side. So in phase one, or the light reaction, we took water. Oops, I forgot the oxygen part. And we converted it into oxygen. All right, so now let's look at phase two. So phase two is called the light independent reactions, which can also be called the dark reactions, or also known as the Calvin cycle. Okay, so any of those three names you will see to describe phase two. So in this phase, ATP and NADPH from phase one are going to be used to make glucose. Okay, so I would highlight, underline, star. That is the big idea of what's going to happen in phase two. All right, so now I want to look at a little more detail into how phase two, or the dark reactions, happen. Okay. So overall, we're going to take the carbon dioxide and we're going to use it to create glucose. Okay, so that's the big idea here. So we have ATP and NADPH that were made in phase one. And these two molecules, they provide a large amount of energy. The only problem is they're not stable enough to store that energy for long periods of time. So therefore, we have to take that energy and store it in a more stable molecule. And so it gets stored in an organic molecule, a carbohydrate like glucose. Okay, so the whole part of this phase is to take the energy from ATP and NADPH and transfer it to glucose, which can store that energy for long periods of time. So the first step of the dark reaction is called carbon fixation. So carbon is taken from the atmosphere, okay, right? We have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it is used to make glucose or sugar. Glucose can then join to other simple sugars, and it can make complex carbohydrates such as starches. Now, the dark reactions or the Calvin cycle, it is much more complicated than just taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turning it into glucose. You need to know the big ideas, so you need to know we're taking CO2 and turning it into glucose. But I do want to go through the Calvin cycle to give you a better idea of what's actually happening. Okay, so in step 1, this is our carbon fixation stage. So carbon dioxide is taken from the atmosphere, and it is going to react with just carbons already in the stroma, and it's going to make this molecule called PGA. Okay, so it's like phosphoglycerate. We can call it PGA for short. Next, the chemical energy that's stored in the NADPH and the ATP, it's going to get transferred to this PGA molecules, and that's going to form these high energy molecules, okay? And this high energy molecule, we're going to call it G3P. So from here, 2 of these G3P molecules, they're going to actually leave the cycle. And then they're going to be used for the production of glucose and other organic compounds. Then the remaining G3P molecules are going to continue this cycle. And this enzyme called rubisco is going to convert them to 5 carbon molecules, or like a 5 carbon chain molecule called ribulose. And then this ribulose is going to continue the cycle. Okay, so the Calvin cycle is an ongoing process in your body to produce glucose or sugar. All right, so now I want to put everything together and show you the big picture of photosynthesis. So here we have our chloroplast. And inside, we have both phase 1 and phase 2 happening at the same time. So here in phase 1, we have our water being added to the system. And through this process, we're producing the NADPH and the ATP, as well as oxygen. The ATP and NADPH, they are used in the Calvin cycle to produce the glucose or the sugar. And then after they're used, the ATP, remember, after it loses the energy in the phosphate, it turns into ADP, which is then recycled back into phase 1 to be converted to ATP again. And the NADPH, it gets converted to NADP with a positive charge, and that also goes back to phase 1 to be recharged and converted to NADPH. So if you look at the big picture in phase 1, water is converted into oxygen gas, and carbon dioxide is converted into the glucose or the sugar. All right, so now let's sum everything up in words. Okay, so we're relating it back to the overall equation. So 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 waters plus light yields glucose and oxygen. Okay. So a few slides ago, we talked about what was happening in phase 1. So in phase 1, we used water. We can add light in here. We used light, and that produced oxygen. And then in phase 2, or in the dark reactions, we're using carbon dioxide to make glucose. So the dark reaction, the whole purpose is to make glucose. And the whole point of that is that the ATP and the NADPH, they're not stable enough to hold that energy. So therefore, the glucose is going to store all that chemical energy in the bonds for a long period of time. And then once those chemical bonds are broken, that energy is going to be released, and then the cell can use that energy for whatever function it's trying to accomplish. The last thing I want to talk about real quick are alternative pathways. So many plants live in extreme environments, and they have to have an alternative pathway for photosynthesis in order to maximize their energy conversions. So the first alternative pathway I want to talk about is called C4 plants. So these maintain photosynthesis while minimizing water loss. And these are going to occur in plants such as sugarcane and corn. A second alternative pathway is called CAM plants. So the CAM stands for crassulacean acid metabolism. So this occurs in water conserving plants such as like cacti, orchids, or pineapple. And we see these pathways happening in like deserts, salt marshes, in any place where water is limited.